Good evening. I hope you're all well. I'm back after a bit of a break. It's really nice to be here and to continue with Pride and Prejudice and just let Instagram do its thing and let people know I'm here. And we'll begin in a minute. If you're watching this back on the replay, then feel free to use this time to get yourself set up, get a comfy seat, your favourite blanket, a cup of tea, a cat, and get ready to settle in for a little while just to relax and listen to the story. We'll begin, as always, by just checking in with ourselves, checking in with our breath, what's going on in our body, where the areas of tension are, where we're holding stress, and just allow ourselves to relax into this peaceful space and float away on the story. I'm going to try and get through 2 chapters tonight, if my battery lasts long enough. We'll see, hopefully I don't get cut off. Okay, so we'll begin, as always, by closing off your eyes, if that's comfortable for you. And if you want, you can place one hand on your heart, one hand on your heart, one on your belly. And take a big breath in. And exhale. Empty it all out. And continue just for a moment. Taking long, slow, full breaths in. And exhale out completely. Empty your lungs. And start to allow yourself to soften and to relax with each breath. And just scan through your body from your toes all the way up. Notice any areas of tension, any sore spots. Allow yourself to grow soft, and your body to feel heavy. Relax now into this space. The work for the day is done. There's nothing else you need to do right now. Slow down. Breathe fully and deeply. And enjoy taking this moment to relax. And I invite you, if you want to, you can stay with your eyes closed, while you listen to the story, if you wish. Just get comfortable, however feels good in your body right now. And we'll continue at the next chapter, chapter 2 of Pride and Prejudice. Mr Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, although, to the last, always assuring his wife that he should not go. Until the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter, employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a way to know what Mr Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs Long has promised to introduce him." "I do not believe Mrs Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her." "No more have I," said Mr Bennet, "and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving on you." Mrs Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but, unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. Have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces." "Kitty has no discretion in her coughs," said her father. "She times them ill." "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty, fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." "Ay, so it is," cried her mother, "and Mrs Long does not come back till the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself." "Then, my dear, you have the advantage of your friend. You may have the advantage of your friend, and introduce Mr Bingley to her." "Impossible, Mr Bennet, impossible. When I am not acquainted with him myself, how can you be so teasing?" "I honour your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will, and after all, Mrs Long and her nieces must stand their chance, and therefore, as she will think it an act of kindness if you decline the office, I will take it on myself." The girls stared at their father. Mrs Bennet said only, "Nonsense, nonsense." "What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation?" cried he. "Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make great extracts." Mary wished to say something very sensible, but knew not how. "While Mary is adjusting her ideas," he continued, "let us return to Mr Bingley." "I am sick of Mr Bingley," cried his wife. "I am sorry to hear that, but why did you not tell me so before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished, that of Mrs Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was just what she had expected all the while. "How good you are, my dear Mr Bennet! But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am! And it is such a good joke too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now." "Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, and as he spoke he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "What an excellent father you have, girls," said she when the door was shut. "I do not know how you will ever make him amends for his kindness, or me either, for that matter. At our time of life it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintances every day, but for your sakes we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I am the tallest." The rest of the evening was spent conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Chapter 3. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject, was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways, with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbour, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favourable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and, to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step toward falling in love, and the very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." In a few days Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much, but he saw only the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and consequently unable to accept the honour of the invitation, etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and she began to fear that he might always be flying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to get a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted the day before the ball by hearing that, instead of 12, he had brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. And when the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked a gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentlemen pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could save him from having the most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. Mr Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, and was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend! Mr Darcy danced only occasionally with one of his own once with Mrs Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs Bennet, whose dislike of his general behaviour was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged, by the scarcity of gentlemen, to sit down for 2 dancers, and during part of that time Mr Darcy had been standing near enough for her to overhear a conversation between him and Mr Bingley, who came from the dance floor for a few minutes to press his friend to join it. "Come, Darcy," said he, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment for me to stand up with." "I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honour, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening, and there are several of them, you see, uncommonly pretty." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" And turning around, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till, catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr Bingley followed his advice. Mr Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings towards him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition, which delighted in anything ridiculous. The evening altogether passed off pleasantly to the whole family. Mrs Bennet had seen her eldest daughter much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by his sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, though in a quieter way. Elizabeth felt Jane's pleasure. Mary had heard herself mentioned to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighbourhood, and Catherine and Lydia had been fortunate enough to never be without partners, which was all they had yet learnt to care for at a ball. They returned, therefore, in good spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived, and of which they were the principal inhabitants. They found Mr Bennet still up. With a book he was regardless of time, and on the present occasion he had a good deal of curiosity as to the event of an evening which had raised such splendid expectations. He had rather hoped that all his wife's views on the stranger would be disappointed, but he soon found that he had a very different story to hear. "Oh, my dear Mr Bennet," as she entered the room, "we have had a most delightful evening, a most excellent ball. I wish you had been there. Jane was so admired, nothing could be like it. Everybody said how well she looked, and Mr Bingley thought her quite beautiful and danced with her twice." "Only think of that, my dear. He actually danced with her twice, and she was the only creature in the room that he asked a second time. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas. I was so vexed to see him stand up with her, but however, he did not admire her at all. Indeed, nobody can, you know. And he seemed quite struck with Jane as she was going down the dance. So he inquired who she was, and got introduced, and asked her for the two next. Then the 2/3 he danced with Miss King, and the 2/4 with Maria Lucas, and the 2/5 with Jane again, and the 2/6 with Lizzie, and if he had any compassion for me," cried her husband impatiently, "he would not have danced half so much. For God's sake, say no more of his partners. Oh, that he had sprained his ankle on the first dance." "Oh, my dear," continued Mrs Bennet, "I am quite delighted with him. He is so excessively handsome, and his sisters are charming women. I never in my life saw anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace upon Mrs Hurst's gown—" Here she was interrupted again. Mr Bennet protested against any description of finery. She was therefore obliged to seek another branch of the subject, and related with much bitterness of spirit and some exaggeration the shocking rudeness of Mr Darcy. "But I can assure you," she added, "that Lizzie does not lose much by not suiting his fancy, for he is a most disagreeable, horrid man, not at all worth pleasing. So high and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so very great. Not handsome enough to dance with. I wish you had been there, my dear, to have given him one of your set-downs. I quite detest the man." So there you have the next 2 chapters. I hope you're enjoying them, and hopefully I'll see you soon. I'm thinking about maybe reading something spooky, so I'll see what I can come up with for you. Let me know if you have any particular requests, and do let me know how you're enjoying Pride and Prejudice. Well, I hope you all have a really good night's sleep, and I'll see you soon. Good night.